You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
There's a lot of chatter out there about Nate Kingz, a 6'5", 190-pound shooting guard from Oregon State. 1 year of eligibility left. He follows GM Alex Klein on Instagram. He follows assistant coach Dan Engelstad. But probably the most concrete proof of interest so far was Brian Higgins on Q Sports Talk saying that he was on campus today. So, Mike, what can you tell us regarding Syracuse and Nate Kingz?
Well, there's kind of been rumblings that there's interest between the two sides for several days. So maybe even up to a week. The fact that he was on campus is not a huge surprise. But he's a big-time shooter. You know, obviously with Syracuse losing Chris Bell in the transfer portal, they need shooting. And even with him on the roster last year, shooting was an issue. Well, Nate Kingz is one of the best shooters in the country, almost 45% last year. The difference is, yes, you can set screens for him and he can be a standstill shooter, but he can also create his own shot. He's really comfortable coming off of screens, and he can drive a little bit. And then he's a pretty good defender as well. He had a pretty good game when Oregon State upset Gonzaga earlier this season. He had 20 points, 4 or 5 rebounds, 3 blocks, and 2 steals against, again, a really good Gonzaga team. So he does a little bit of everything. I think he's a good fit. I wouldn't surprise me if they're recruiting him with the possibility of him starting at the 3. With JJ at the 2, and then, you know, assuming they get a point guard from the portal. I think that's a possibility. But again, big time shooter, really good athlete, and just seems to fit a lot of what Syracuse has been missing the last couple of seasons.
Gotcha. And I just want to confirm with you, he was on campus today with Syracuse?
I haven't directly confirmed that. From a direct source myself, but Brian Higgins, I do not believe was making that up. And I did check in with a few sources to check in to see if he was on campus. I had heard rumors of a couple different players, and the couple other players that I had checked on, I was told no. And then when I asked about Nate Kingz, I got no response. That usually is telling, but I don't have direct confirmation on it.
Kind of have to do the whole, who was it, Brian Windhorst? Why is that?
Why is that? That's right.
Why are they all of a sudden not responding to my text about this play? I asked about this player, asked about that player, but then I asked about this one, Nate Kingz, and all of a sudden I don't get a response. And Brian Higgins, I don't see why he'd be lying there on Q Sports Talk about him. So you mentioned that Syracuse, they see him as more of a 3. Is there any way that they're recruiting him maybe to come off the bench?
That's possible. Again, this is my guess. This isn't anything I've specifically been told about how he would fit, but they don't have a small forward on the roster right now. They don't, unless they're going to have Kyan play there.
Or Aaron Womack, I guess.
Or Aaron Womack, right. Both of those guys are kind of undersized at the 3. But to be honest with you, so is Nate Kingz. You know, they're kind of all in the 6'4", 6'5" type range, maybe 6'6" with Womack if you're pushing it a little bit. But typically with Syracuse wings, you're thinking of 6'7", 6'8", right? These guys aren't that. So it's speculation on my part, but I could see him potentially starting there if he earns the spot during camp. I could see him coming off the bench as either spelling JJ, or if they decide to move JJ over to the 1 in certain rotations. I could see him playing some 3 if they decide to go 3 guards. I think he gives you some options, and so that's part of the attractiveness as well.
All right, so that's Nate Kingz, the 6'5", 190-pound shooting guard from Oregon State. 1 year of eligibility left, 44.6% from 3 last year, and it appears that rumor about Syracuse and Nate Kingz' potential interest is very much real. I want to get to a point guard now. Another one that's kind of a person of interest here in the Syracuse circles. Nick Boyd, 6'3", 170-pound point guard from San Diego State. Also, I believe, has 1 year of eligibility. Kind of a hometown kid. Not really. I mean, he's from Bronx, New York. That's not too far from Syracuse. He's mostly been connected just from the articles that I've looked up here, North Carolina and Wisconsin. However, there was a Wisconsin insider here, Dylan Graff, who mentioned that Syracuse was also among those teams that were poking around at Nick Boyd. So, Mike, I'll turn it over to you. How involved is Syracuse with Boyd?
Well, it's interesting because he was one of the people that was, I said there were some rumors that other players were visiting Syracuse along with Nate Kingz, and he was one of the rumors. Now, I was able to confirm that he was not, in fact, visiting, but the fact that there was that level of a rumor, and you've heard that there is some interest, I don't know that there's, some sort of extensive connection like there is seemingly with Nate Kingz at this point. It's hard to really discern where they are in terms of how hard they're pushing for certain guys. They're keeping everything extremely close to the vest. So a lot of this is speculation and reading tea leaves, but he is a New York kid. They need a point guard. He's got multiple years of experience. I know he was at San Diego State last year, but the 3 years prior to that, he was with Florida Atlantic. And we remember those 2-3 years when Florida Atlantic was really good and they made that Final Four run and whatever. He was on those teams. So, and he's got 82 starts in his college career. He's shooting 37% from three for his college career. He averaged 4 assists and 4 rebounds and a steal per game last year, the most minutes he's played during his career. He seems to check a lot of boxes, and he's 6'3" at the point guard spot, which is a little different than the 5'10", 5'11", Jaquan Carlos that they had this past season, even, having Kyle Cuff in there. So it seems like it would be a good fit from a lot of ways, better shooter than what they've had, better size than what they've had, and can score at all 3 levels. But as far as where the interest goes, most of the chatter around him has centered around Wisconsin and North Carolina. I think most kind of consider North Carolina a slight favorite between those two. But, if Syracuse can continue to operate behind the scenes and behind the shadows, and then, we've seen it with other players that all of a sudden a surprise announcement happens. I think that's their best case scenario if they want to get Boyd, is to try to operate that way, as opposed to having a very public, I'm going to visit all these 3 schools and then kind of see where things play out.